Hello everyone, Books with Banks back again, and as promised a few videos ago, more Malazan content. Today I'll be talking specifically about Book 7, Reaper's Gale, so expect full spoilers for this novel, as well as pretty much everything before it, especially everything in Midnight Tides. Yeah. But why am I talking about Reaper's Gale specifically? I have a sort of argumentative thesis specifically pertaining to what Erikson is trying to accomplish with three characters in the first half of Reaper's Gale. Well, I say first half, I am going to talk about one scene from a bit later on, as I have seen a few great book reviews and booktubers lately talking about how, while they still like Reaper's Gale, it is one of their least favorites. And based on those reviews and just other things I've seen and read, conversations I've had in the Malazan fandom community, I'm confident in the claim that most people struggle to enjoy at least the first half of this book. So, what I'm trying to do here today isn't to change anyone's mind about how much you enjoy or don't enjoy this one, but to highlight something Erikson is doing in these first 600 pages or so that might help folks enjoy the beginning of the book more than maybe they did the first time they read it, or more than it seems like people tend to enjoy this. This whole idea centers around this trio that I've identified. Let's call them the Shadow Triumvirate, even though I know the word shadow can mean quite a lot in the context of Malazan. But putting the Warrens, ironically putting the Teist Eater even aside, putting aside Kellanvet and Dancer, maybe it's better to just think about my use of the term shadow here as a synonym of secret. And I have a little more to say before I get to revealing who those characters are, so if you want to play along, try to see if you can guess the three characters I'm talking about while I kind of continue to ramble for a minute in this intro. Okay. So before I get to kind of the main argument, a couple of quick shout-outs to some of the booktubers I mentioned above, specifically Zachary Shea and Ramel Broadcasting. Their channels are linked down below. Again, I love their channels, and I totally respect their reactions to this book. They both still really liked it. I'm not trying to say anyone is wrong in their take or reaction or critique. In fact, such critiques have helped me to reflect on why I personally enjoy maybe this less popular section of the series more than others do. So that's really kind of the wonderful thing about what we do here. So a big thank you to those channels. Again, they're linked down below. Now, a bit about my personal experience with Reaper's Gale. First and foremost, you should understand my bias. I really liked the first four Malazan novels, but I don't think I was fully in love or invested in all things Malazan until I got to Book 5, Midnight Tides. My love of that novel and many of the characters, settings, and stories it shares with Reaper's Gale is really important to note here. In other words, I was pretty much primed to enjoy this book from the get-go. If you found yourself struggling a bit to enjoy Midnight Tides more than others, then you and I are already kind of starting off on very different footings from coming into Book 7. And now, getting a bit more specific, people generally love the back half of Reaper's Gale. They love the Bone Hunter's brutal but hilarious march towards Letheras and Beak's heartwarming and heartbreaking piece of that story. They love the convergence of everyone in Letheras, but also everyone in the Refugium, and the climactic twist, sort of, even though pretty heavily foreshadowed, of what happens with Selchus and Kettle. The conclusions to all of those traveling parties, and then Red Mask is a bit hit or miss, but I think everyone generally likes Talk's point of view in that storyline, as they also like the tragic conclusion that wraps that one up. So, a lot to love with the second half of Reaper's Gale, but for me, even with everything crazy and exciting going on all over the place, I always prefer the chapters set in Letheras, no matter where we're at in this book. And it's not just Tehol and Bug. I love them. I actually find them funnier here than I did in Midnight Tides. But no, this city setting for me rivals even Darujhistan as my favorite urban setting in the series. I love the Ratcatcher's Guild. I love the palace intrigue. I love everything around the Azath Tower. I love the tension between Bug and the Errant. And I love how death and debt are both explored in this setting. And with Reaper's Gale, Erikson so clearly and beautifully explores a sociopolitical situation that I don't think I've ever seen any author tackle, or at least not in as compelling a way. One of Erikson's main goals here, among many others, was to explore what happens when a conquered people still retain enough of their toxic and destructive culture and institutions to poison their conquerors and to destabilize the new regime from within. In other words, the Teist Idor have conquered the Letherai, but they left so much of the cultural ideology in place, and they failed to control so many of the formerly powerful actors in that Letherai system that now the conquered system threatens to destroy its conquerors. In even other words, Erikson's words, in fact, let's look at the opening epigraph to Chapter 1. I'll say this, when looking for the goals of an author, it's always a great idea to look at something like an opening epigraph, but a slight caveat here, in this case, the epigraph comes after a 4-part prologue and a poem to open subbook 1, so the epigraph in question doesn't appear until actually page 41, so not exactly at the beginning, but still close enough. And Erikson attributes this to the historian Dineth Arnara. So here's the passage. Quote, "Two forces, once in vicious opposition, now found themselves virtual bedmates, although neither could decide which of them had their legs pried open first. The simple facts are these. The original hierarchical structure of the Teist Idor tribes proved well suited to the Letherai system of power through wealth. The Idor became the crown, settling easy upon the bloated gluttony of Lether. But does a crown possess will? Does the wearer buckle beneath its burden? Another truth is now, in hindsight, self-evident. As seamless as this merging seemed to be, a more subtle, far deadlier conjoining occurred below the surface, that of the specific flaws within each system, and this blending was to prove a most volatile brew." End quote. Now, this Arnara historian character in that quote, it sounds like he's arguing that it was a blending of the Idor and Letherai cultures. I would actually challenge that position slightly, as I feel like with the 3 characters I'm about to bring into this, I think all 3 of them would have and could have done the same things if any other culture had tried to conquer Lether. So, who are these 3 important individuals? First, let me say that I think looking at early scenes of all 3 of these shadow characters in this book can help us, 1, enjoy the beginning of the book more, playing this sort of detective role, trying to puzzle out exactly why the Idor control and authority is so weak, and 2, it can make us more engaged with some of the newer characters, and or some characters people don't really ever have that much to say about. Again, the premise of my argument, I think most of us can agree that Erikson is exploring something really fascinating here with how the Letherai held on to their culture and used this regime shift to their advantage, and how they were successfully able to poison the Idor forces that took them over kind of from within. We all agree that's a cool idea. I'm assuming we all generally agree that that's a really fascinating thing that Erikson's working with here. I'm suggesting that a closer reading of these 3 specific characters can both make the beginning of this book more enjoyable, and this exercise can deepen the level at which we talk about this fascinating dynamic. So, drum roll please, here we go. A lot of build-up, suspense. In order of most to least memorable, probably, and they're all pretty close, but we have Chancellor Triban Null, Patriotist Invigilator Keros Invictad, and Master of the Liberty Consign of Merchants Rautos Hivenar. Triban, Keros, and Rautos. We'll wait to talk about Triban Null, because by this point readers already know him, and Erikson isn't particularly eager to reintroduce this character, or at least not right away, but he does introduce the other 2 not only in Chapter 1, but in the first 2 scenes of Chapter 1. Picking right up where we left off with that historian epigraph, the first chapter starts with a conversation between Keros Invictad and Tenal Yathvanar. Don't worry, we're not talking about the disgusting and despicable actions of Tenal Yathvanar today, but Keros and Tenal discuss Keros' exceptional skill with solving little puzzles and puzzle boxes, his genius, his power, and so on. Tenal even describes Keros as, quote, the most powerful man next to the emperor himself, end quote. That's page 45 in this edition. The Tor mass market. Okay. And near the end of the scene, their conversation introduces readers to Rautos Hivenar and the Liberty Consign. They explain that Rautos is concerned about disappearing funds and a looming financial crisis. This is one of my favorite things about studying these chapters. We all love Tehol and Bug, and I think most readers devote their complete attention and interest to most of those scenes, but I would argue that you can't truly appreciate the genius of Tehol and Bug without a careful study of this triumvirate of their antagonists that they spend the entire novel actively trying to undermine. So let's move on to Scene 2, Character 2, Rautos Hivenar, and his introduction. Rautos describes the situation of his enemy, Tehol, as follows. On this page 47 through 48 here. Even as he began to perceive that somewhere out there was an enemy or enemies bent on the singular task of economic sabotage, not mere embezzlement, an activity with which he was personally very familiar, but something more profound, all-encompassing, an enemy. To all that sustained Rautos Hivenar and the Liberty Consign of which he was master, indeed, to all that sustained the empire itself, regardless of who sat upon the throne, regardless even of those savage, miserable barbarians who were now preening at the very pinnacle of Letheras society, like gray-feathered jackdaws atop a board of baubles. Okay, so not only does the language there point out Rautos's concern about this unknown enemy in the city, but the actual diction used to describe the Eador points those out as, or that group out as a group that Rautos just automatically still considers his enemy. This is the case for Kairos and Triban as well. Two more things of interest here. Rautos' certainty and his near obsession with kind of the status quo and stability that has made himself and these other merchants also wealthy, or at least the conditions that have allowed them to remain powerful despite the Eador takeover. He's so certain that this system is set up well and should not be destabilized or reorganized in some kind of way. So that's what the quote. With this whole scene itself, kind of our introduction to him, something else of interest to point out here, Rautos is becoming obsessed with these mysterious artifacts exposed through the odd flooding patterns in the city. Of course, we all know that those floods might have to do with Bug or Mail, but I think this obsession of Rautos's is a helpful metaphor for his slowly uncovering the financial instability of the city, just as he's uncovering the instability of all of these structures, and he's unearthing more and more mysterious things throughout the book, basically assaulting his sense of certainty. Okay, now quickly back to Kairos before we move on to Triban Null. So we see Kairos meeting with Rautos actually later in this chapter. In this meeting, Rautos explains to Kairos, quote, "The Liberty Consign thrives precisely because its members hold to the conviction of being the most powerful players in an unassailable system. Confidence is a most fragile quality." So this is when Rautos is asking Kairos to use the secret police, the Patriotists, to investigate what's going on and who's taking their money. And Rautos is very specific. This investigation has to be secret. The Emperor can't know about it. He doesn't really want the Eador to know that much about it either. So then, in the next chapter, Kairos continues to push his warped worldview onto Tanel Yathvanar, as he explains. Let's find this one. "A citizen with certainty, Yathvanar, can be swayed, turned, can be made into a most diligent ally. All one needs to do is find what threatens them the most, ignite their fear, burn to cinders the foundations of their certainty, then offer an equally certain alternate way of thinking, of seeing the world. They will reach across, no matter how wide the gulf, and grasp and hold on to you with all their strength. No, the certain are not our enemies." End quote. Okay, so I believe I've demonstrated through kind of the connections between these quotes how at least this alliance between Keros and Rautos is based on their mutual certainty in each other and their mutual reliance on the other to maintain their respective positions of power. Neither are questioning the ethics of the Patriot or of the Liberty Consign. And I think such a certain ally that Keros is looking for is exactly what he's found in Rautos Hivenar, and vice versa. Yeah. So now let's move on to our third member of the Triumvirate, essentially the vessel through which these other two are able to simultaneously reach and avoid Emperor Frulad. We have Chancellor Triban Null. We're reintroduced to this character through the perspective of the Emperor's first concubine, Nisal. She explains, more often of late, it was the Chancellor who dominated the advising. She had come to realize that Triban Null had begun to view her as a rival. He was the principal organizer of the petitions, the filter that kept the numbers manageable, and his office had burgeoned accordingly. That his expanded staff also served as a vast and invasive web of spies in the palace was, of course, a given. So Triban Null basically controls all the information getting to the Emperor. In the following scene, Triban Null is actually introduced on the page, and he is confronted by the Eater Bruthen Tranna. And Tranna is concerned about the Patriotists, what he has seen, how they're treating prisoners, specifically academics and scholars. And this scene of Bruthen Tranna confronting Triban Null is a great example of what we just heard about Nisal's kind of broader, more general perspective on how Triban Null is controlling the flow of information to the Emperor. So hopefully now I've demonstrated not only how all three of these men work so well together to keep themselves in power. Please feel free to read the various sections referred to in this video for a more complete picture of the scenes discussed. But I hope I'm conveying how much fun it can be to put this stuff together. And now I want to shift into what I consider the really fun and really exciting part of all of this. As I was reading through the Keros and Rautos scenes, I started to think, oh wow, I could maybe do something cool with this idea of certainty, and I did talk about that a bit already. So next time you read Reaper's Gale, if you haven't previously, I'd recommend keeping track of the different certainty and confidence levels of the characters. But by introducing Triban Null into the mix, I found a slightly different theme or thread to pull on, and that's this idea of obsession. All three of these men, sure, they all start out this book in positions of extreme authority and control, yet all three are distracted by their obsessions, all of which are oddly similar in a way. So first, and most obviously, we have Keros and Victad's obsession with these little puzzles and puzzle boxes, and his inability to solve Tejal's puzzle with the bug plays a major part in his downfall near the end of the book. Second, you have Rautos Hivenar, and Hivenar comments early on around that quote that I pulled, like a little after that quote. But he comments early on about his obsession with these unearthed artifacts, and this turns into his sort of urban infrastructural history obsession throughout the whole book. He's ultimately crushed by one of the collapsing structures that he's exploring. And third, curious to note that both Keros and Rautos' obsessions dealt with them physically handling like smaller man-made items or artifacts with their hands. And our third character's obsession, Triban Null's obsession, is the ironic beauty of just his hands and how his hands couldn't ever make beautiful art, but they could commit cruelty in what he considered a beautiful way. So that's really the only place where I'm pulling from something a little later in the book to bring into this conversation, and that's the beginning of chapter 18, page 800. In this book, Triban Null, for about a page and a half, kind of reflects on his hands and the role that his beautiful hands have played in his history, his love life, cruel and violent as it has been. I just love that they all have to do with their hands, and now I'm reading this as a symptom of their equal obsession with control and power and dominance over their ability to shape and mold and solve the destabilizing puzzles of Letheras, up until they all, of course, fail to hold it all together. And I just think it's brilliant, and it at least helps me to enjoy these unlikable characters. Some I consider them slightly boring characters, but all of this, going through how we're introduced to them and reintroduced to them, picking out various themes and symbols, at least for me, that's what makes these books so much fun. And I think Reaper's Gale is full of so many of these opportunities. Anyway, I think I'll end on that note. Of course, it's understandable if these sections or characters still don't appeal to you, or if maybe you might agree with all of this, that this stuff is a lot of fun, but maybe these aren't your main storyline frustrations with Reaper's Gale. Again, I'm not trying to change anyone's mind about whether or not you should enjoy this book. I'm just trying to give a few suggestions for those of you who might someday reread this one, hoping to maybe get a little bit more out of it on those successive read-throughs. All that said, thank you all so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.